Who are you listening to these days? Hey everyone, I'm the Saxophone Oracle, and this week we're talking about ways of developing a great saxophone sound. Typically, when we talk about sound exercises, things like long tones, things like overtones, right? These kind of things. And yes, these are extremely important. There's no way around it. We have to practice these things to get a good sound. Often, people talk about gear, not the Saxophone Oracle, because you all know I'm not a big fan of gear, but people are really big into gear and the importance of gear for a sound. Things like mouthpiece, things like the horn you play, ligatures, reeds. In my opinion, that's talked about way too much because it's really almost completely unimportant. What I want to talk about today is something that I don't think gets nearly enough attention, and that's the idea that we have to train our ears in order to get a great saxophone sound. That's right, we have to be able to learn to recognize what a good saxophone sound is in order to produce it, because at the end of the day, saxophone tone starts and ends right here, in the ears. We need to have a good sound concept. We need to have a great reference of what an ideal sound is. Otherwise, we're inevitably going to sound like beginners all the time. I want to start by sharing a story. So there's this player who's been playing for quite some time. They're a reasonably decent player. They read music well, they understand theory and harmony. They play music that's at a reasonably advanced level. They've been taking one-on-one lessons for quite some time. The thing is that in the sound department, sound and phrasing, they still sound pretty much like a beginner. Not an absolute beginner, but still pretty rudimentary. And when I see players like this, I'm wondering to myself, well, how is this possible? Clearly this person is taking this seriously, they're putting in the time and effort needed, and they're getting better in all aspects of playing except for the sound. It's kind of strange. And then I was watching a saxophone talk, and it was mostly beginners and intermediate players, and the topic was, who are the saxophone players you are listening to? And people were sharing, and a lot of people were new to saxophone, so they didn't know a lot of players, and people were suggesting pop players and classical players and jazz players and everything. It was really interesting. Now this person chimes in and proudly chimes in to say, well, I've been playing for about 8 years and I still don't listen to saxophone. Ha 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 ha. Right? Like this is some kind of great achievement. and immediately I was like, bing, 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 light bulbs going off everywhere. Of course, that's why. It makes perfect sense. This person has no concept of what a saxophone is supposed to sound like or could possibly sound like. Ear training is about so much more than simply being able to recognize or differentiate between pitches. Human beings, people, most people listen to music on an absurdly superficial level. It's ridiculous. Okay, people hear songs as entities unto themselves. It's like they hear a blob of sound and they either like it or they dislike it, and they have no idea why. They can't differentiate between different instruments most of the time, certainly not between different rhythms, nothing on the level of production value, right? They like it or they don't. Sure, someone will say, well, that lyric really touches me. Or maybe I like the beat, meaning there's like the bass drum going forward to the floor and it makes them want to dance. But they don't know what's happening. It's just a blob of noise. And we're all like this. We all experience music like this until we train ourselves to start paying attention and tuning into what's actually happening. I fell in love with the saxophone at a really early age, probably before I could walk. And that's because my mom loved music. There was always music on in the house. It was mostly pop music. There were other things sprinkled in, but there was always music on. And I grew up in the 1980s, so virtually every song you heard on the radio had a saxophone solo in it. And I loved the saxophone, but I couldn't tell you if a player was good or bad, or if someone was better than another. I couldn't tell you if someone was playing an alto or a tenor or a soprano. I just didn't know. It was just all saxophone to me. And it took years of listening until I was able to tell these differences. When I started playing saxophone and when I started getting exposed to jazz, I was immediately drawn into the flashy stuff, the higher, the faster, the louder, the big band, all this stuff. Like it had nothing to do about the nuance of the music. I wasn't interested in anything other than the stuff that grabbed me viscerally, right? My ears just weren't tuned into anything else. And if I heard a player play some kind of fast line like Cannonball Adderley or Charlie Parker, I couldn't differentiate that there was really different pitches happening, or if it was a scale or an arpeggio. It was just a smear. It was a shape that was either pleasing or not pleasing to me. And then when it came to telling the difference between players, I mean, forget about it. I would listen to Wayne Shorter and John Coltrane, and I couldn't tell you who was who. I didn't even hear a difference, probably. But now, if I listen to those two players, it's almost like I'm hearing two people play completely different instruments, even though they're playing the tenor saxophone, both of them. It's the same thing as with language. I mean, good luck learning to speak Spanish or French or any language for that matter from a book. Like that, it doesn't work. You have to immerse yourself in it. You have to hear it. You have to know how it sounds, how it's supposed to sound, how the rhythm of it goes. It's just the way it is. There are 5 things that I'd like everyone to take away from this week's video. First, we have to listen to any and all saxophone players. We have to expose ourselves to it as much and as often as possible. Even if it's something you don't think you necessarily like, it's worth taking a little bit of time, trying to hear it, trying to understand it. And especially if you ever have the opportunity to hear live music, a real saxophonist in front of you, go as much as you can, because it's a completely different experience than hearing it on a recording. The second thing, we have to listen to the players who have the type of sound that we're trying to achieve. So if you're a classical saxophonist, for example, you want to be listening to like Fred Hemke, Eugene Russo, Marcel Mule, Jean-Marie Londex, I don't know, Branford Marsalis, right? I know next to nothing about classical saxophone, but I do know a handful of players. You have to be aware of these things. If you're into pop saxophone, you want to be listening to guys like Dave Sanborn, Dave Koz, Maceo Parker, Kirk Whalum, Candy Dulfer, Kenny G. If you're into rock and roll saxophone, then, you know, Clarence Clemens, Leroy Moore, King Curtis, Lenny Pickett, all these kinds of players. It's just, you have to do that. The third thing, try to stay open. Try not to let yourself be stubborn or closed off about your musical tastes, because I guarantee you over time these things are going to change, especially in music. The better you get at your instrument, the more time you spend listening and tuning into all these things that we're talking about, you're going to find that you like all kinds of things that you didn't realize you liked. And a lot of music that got you into playing saxophone or got you into music all of a sudden is going to maybe not sound so great to you. It's normal. This happens. So try and be open to this. 4, when we do pick up our instruments, when we are playing our instruments, it's important to keep these sonic references right there at the front of our brains. Because when we're playing our long tone exercises and we're making slight adjustments and things like this, we want to be asking ourselves, well, is this getting me closer to what I'm striving towards, or is it going the opposite direction? And we need to be playing along with recordings of these players that we admire. Ideally, we're transcribing the solos and playing along, but at the very least, getting a transcription or the sheet music from somewhere else and trying to play along, trying to emulate their sound and their nuance as much as possible. 5, don't fall into the gear trap. Remember, gear has little to almost nothing to do with your saxophone sound. In fact, I encourage you to watch a video I did recently. It's called Charlie Parker Didn't Care About Mouthpieces, and Neither Should You. And in that video, I demonstrate, I play 10 different mouthpieces to show people that even though they're 10 drastically different mouthpieces, when I play them, they all sound pretty much exactly the same, because the sound happens here and not in the gear. Anyone who has a decent quality, middle-of-the-road mouthpiece should be able to get pretty much any sound that they're trying to go for. You don't need a $1,000, $2,000 Dave Gardella mouthpiece to sound like Michael Brecker. I mean, Michael Brecker didn't. Sure, he played one, but before that he played a Dukoff, before that he played an Autolink, and he always sounded like Michael Brecker. Sure, if you're playing on a Selmer C-Star and you're trying to sound like Michael Brecker, then it's going to be a lot more difficult because you're working against the equipment, right? The equipment is designed for certain things. Just as if you're trying to sound like Stan Getz and you're playing like a Jody Jazz Super Jet or a Theowani Shiva, or like these mouthpieces that are designed to peel paint off the walls, you're going to have a lot harder time. But it's still possible. Like that's how gear works. It's designed to make it a little bit easier for you to get the sound that you're going to create on your own. But it does nothing to create the sound for you. That all happens here. To finish up today, I came up with a list of saxophone players that I think are worth listening to, or at least familiarizing ourselves with on each of the different saxophones. So I'll put this up as a PDF on the website, thesaxophoneoracle.com, so you can take a closer look. By no means is this a complete list or a comprehensive list, and it's not the Oracle saying these are the best players. These are just players that I came up with off the top of my head that I think are worth investigating with the goal of learning to achieve the ideal saxophone sound that we are searching for. So if you have other suggestions, other noteworthy players that I haven't mentioned, then please drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear it, and if there's someone that I've never heard of, I'd love to check them out. In no particular order, starting with soprano saxophone: John Coltrane, Sidney Bechet, Steve Lacy, Branford Marsalis, Wayne Shorter, Chris Potter, Dave Liebman, Grover Washington Jr., Joe Lovano, Stefano Di Battista. On alto saxophone: Charlie Parker, Cannonball Adderley, Johnny Hodges, Phil Woods, Ornette Coleman, Jackie McLean, Art Pepper, Sonny Stitt, Eric Dolphy, Lee Konitz, Kenny Garrett, Dave Sanborn, Paul Desmond, Lou Donaldson, Maceo Parker, Benny Carter, Vincent Herring, Mo Kaufman, Dick Oates. Tenor saxophone: Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, John Coltrane, Dexter Gordon, Sonny Rollins, Joe Henderson, Wayne Shorter, Mike Brecker, Joe Lovano, Stan Getz, Warren Marsh, Jerry Bergonzi, George Garzone, Steve Grossman, Johnny Griffin, Jimmy Heath, Stanley Turrentine, Hank Mobley, Yusef Lateef, Ben Webster, Grover Washington Jr., Chris Potter, Jan Garbarek, David Liebman, Charlie Rouse, Branford Marsalis, Ernie Watts, Eddie Harris, Josh Redman, Ralph Moore, Bob Mincer, the list goes on and on. Baritone: Pepper Adams, Jerry Mulligan, Ronnie Cuber, Rick Brignola, Gary Smullian, Cecil Payne, Harry Carney. And then finally, some sax sections. We should be listening to sax sections as well. Count Basie Orchestra, the Ellington Band, Super Sax, GRP Big Band, Stan Kenton's Band, Mel Lewis, Thad Jones, Woody Herman, Rob McConnell's Boss Brass, Glenn Miller, Buddy Rich. I'm the Saxophone Oracle. This week we're talking about the importance of listening and training our ears in order to get the saxophone sound that we desire. I hope you found the information useful, helpful. As always, please remember to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you, as always, for continuing to watch. I really appreciate it. I wish you a great week. Happy practicing. See you next Tuesday.